A podcast is the only content format on YouTube right now where an unfunny person sits on a chair for 2.5 hours and you watch the whole thing. The only skill required to edit a podcast is that you have moving fingers. Even if you have one moving finger, it's fine. Like Stephen Hawking can edit a podcast compared to a movie, I'm saying. I mean, it's a growing industry. See, I came from radio, right? And I'll tell you what's the difference between radio and podcast. People listen to radio. Okay, it's not that bad. I'm just kidding. But why am I telling you about my journey or experience as a podcaster? Is because today we have a podcast with Gautam Raj Ananth, the CEO of Hubhopper. Yeah, which is the podcast hosting platform in India. And there's a lot of gold in this for you. For somebody who listens to podcast, who enjoys podcast, this podcast is for you. Let's dive in. So, first of all, welcome on the show. I'm so happy to be with you here on the show because, uh, I have a whole speech written out, right? So, uh, you've been recognized as one of the Forbes 30 under 30 in Asia in the recent years. Hubhopper has grown massively, right? And you have also been awarded as the Entrepreneur of the Year for 2018 by or the Entrepreneur magazine. And apart from you, I mean, the platform being present on 15 languages and everything that I want to say on this large speech that I've written down, I want to just let you know on a casual note that I love you, man. I am
Oh,
so
thank you,
happy that
man.
we are doing this. I am so happy that we're doing this because it's like talking to the, to the grandeur, the talking to the ultimate person who we can get our hands on in terms of a podcast, in terms of recording, in terms of production. And there are so many podcasters who are cropping up in the country. It'll be great to have a conversation with you.
I truly appreciate that. I mean, I think you're giving me much more credit than I deserve, and I'm very grateful for that and happy to take it. Um, I I I still think I know one drop in the ocean of what's needed to be known in the podcasting landscape. And like I'll give you a small example. So we've been in the podcasting space now since what, 2016, 2015, 16, 17, so whatever. So like I feel that that's, it's been a very long period. And when we had started, there was no podcast tech, or no, people didn't necessarily know about podcasting. So I sometimes, think, okay, like um we were here when podcasting didn't necessarily exist. But yesterday, for example, itself, I was on a call with an individual who is in something called the Podcast Hall of Fame. His name is Rob Greenlee. He is such an OG in podcasting that he is friends with the guy who started podcasting. Um, and and he has worked at all the major companies, and he started his first podcast in 2004, before the word podcast existed, and when it was called an audio blog. And he is such an OG that he owned the domain audioblog.com. So
Oh
so it
my
does put things into
God.
perspective for me when I'm having these sorts of conversations with, like, there was basically like this large sort of, like, there was this meetup of like 10, 15 people that we'd all organized together, of people in the podcasting industry, and different people. And it's really interesting because when you hear somebody with that perspective and you understand, the wisdom that they come with, then you know it gives you context into how bloody long and far this medium has come from when it initially started.
Hmm. Because I think we are in the starting. I mean, at least in India, we're in the beginning phase of the whole curve, which is just like booming as we are talking right now. Because, I mean, I'm going back to the story of the first movie in India, which was made in Kerala by a humble man who went abroad and he got this recorder, and then he got a couple of local theater artists. So the biggest struggle in that stage, at least, is the setup, right? And I think this is a very relevant conversation. You were just talking about Zoom. I still use Zoom. You're on Zoom right now. So a lot of podcasters like me, so many people come to studio and they're trying to set up the podcast, the journey ahead. So a lot of these nitty gritties are lost in the process, like exactly what to go with and what not to go with. So you were talking about Zoom, why there's an alternative to Zoom, and why Zoom is maybe not the most preferred, approach to online recordings. Why is that?
So, generally, um, you'd be seeing a mass exodus of people moving from. So there are pros and cons. I wouldn't say that Zoom is a bad platform, but one should at least know the options that they have. Uh,
Yeah.
so where is Zoom a good platform? Let's start with positives. Zoom is a phenomenal platform when you're bringing on guests of varied backgrounds and very different ages and demographics. It's a user experience everybody understands. When somebody gets a Zoom link, nobody feels anxious, and they normally have the application downloaded anyway, so it seamlessly fits into their day. So that's a pro, because you're never going to send a Zoom link to somebody and then they're going to be like, what the hell is this? But then there's a massive con with Zoom, because Zoom meets Teams, all of these Blue Jeans, Chime, all of these platforms came up uh, for the sheer purpose of making sure that meetings could happen efficiently. And then they had their boom during COVID. And their prime objective is to make sure that meetings are just as reliable and as easy as in-person meetings were the ad- prior to COVID hitting us the way that it did. So as a consequence of that, the solution that they try to make certain is that the software is um, going to be reliable in every use case. So even if somebody's internet is dropping, the platform a platform like Zoom, its primary objective is to make sure that the meeting doesn't end. Even if somebody's internet drops altogether, it'll make sure the meeting doesn't end. Even if whatever be the case, it's going to try and make sure that this connectivity is not lost. And how does it make sure that the connectivity is not lost? It starts to give up on certain other things. So it'll start to give up on audio quality. It'll start to give up on video quality. It'll start to give up on everything just to make sure that that tie is not broken, right? Now, while that's great from a meeting perspective, it's really bad from a podcast perspective, because podcast listeners and viewers are both consciously and subconsciously very sensitive to changes. So when the output of your podcast does come out and somebody's watching it or listening to it, and suddenly there's going to be a change in the quality that happened as a consequence of you using Zoom, um, they will immediately feel a retort. They'll immediately feel that something's changed, and that connection that they had, how they had sort of felt as though they were completely deep in the conversation itself and like a fly on the wall, that breaks. And that's something that you really don't want. You don't want quality to change. So on the other hand, what people do tend to use more often, in at least in the West, are platforms like Squadcast, Riverside,
Yeah.
which are platforms specifically built for podcast recording. And
Mhm.
their objective is actually the polar opposite of Zoom. Their objective is that we will make sure that the quality remains constant regardless of the situation. So it will even potentially stop recordings or tell people that there's a change in the internet connectivity. Make sure that it's known that you should potentially pause your recording, fix something, and then do a second retake, just so that
Mhm.
at the end the output that's created is such that everybody who's listening or viewing has a seamless experience in terms of quality. And the second thing that it does is, because of it being because of it sort of not being like Zoom, that is a one size fits all solution. It's also aware of the fact that um, with a podcast, you need a little bit of variability. So, like, it will allow you to play around with a lot of different different structures of people speaking. Like, so you can have me at a different size, you at a different size. When I'm speaking, the focus comes on me completely with a different type of animation and transition. When you speak, the focusing come on you completely. I've seen people using these technologies in really fun ways. In fact, some podcasters will, and this was a weird request that I'd had once. So one person had told me that I would love to have you on my show. The one thing that we need is we need you to sit on a blue sofa. So I said, okay, why? And we need the mic to come in from this side. So I said, why? Like, why on earth would you need this? It's such a peculiar request. Um, and the genius that they had was that they basically, as hosts, were also sitting on a blue sofa, and they put the frame side by side in such a manner that my blue sofa merged into their blue sofa, so that the output made it look like we are actually sitting right next to one another, and that one
Yeah.
camera, yeah, so one mic was coming in from one side and their mic was coming in from one side, and it actually looked good. So I was shocked myself, and you can do a lot of more of this sort of stuff with platforms like the one that I'm mentioning. So Squadcast is good, Riverside is good as well. A lot of people are using Riverside. They all have their pros and cons, but yeah.
Oh. When I was in radio, I heard this, this thing from my seniors, my uh, people who were grooming me, that Bharat, radio is the theater of the mind. It is a theater
Yeah.
of the mind. And there's this particular audience for radio, people who enjoy the theater of the mind. And then there is, of course, the theater for I won't say heart, but there's music. What I'm trying to get to is that there's movies, and there's this always this particular audience for each of these different content formats. When it comes to podcasts, I think this is something that you would definitely have. Your opinion would be gold here. Is who is the podcast listener, the ideal podcast listener, the average listener?
Hmm. It's a very interesting question. That's a really interesting question. First, I actually want to touch on the theater of the mind because that's used a lot in podcasting as well. Like people talk about podcasting as theater of the mind, and there's also a major reason for that. I think podcasting to a very large degree is a disciple of radio. And a lot of people often also say, is podcasting going to be the death of radio? No, I think it's going to be the savior of radio.
I have that
You
question in
know,
my list. Okay, all right.
yeah, it's going to be the savior of radio, and it's going to be, and it has been in the West to a very large degree. That's why iHeart moved towards podcasting in a big way. SiriusXM moved towards podcasting in a big way. Why people call both podcasting and radio theater of the mind also is quite interesting. They call them this because it's the one format in which you co-create. That's why it's theater of the mind. So the visual, so the audio storyteller is the RJ, or the podcaster, and the visual storyteller is the listener. So it's really interesting because you are creating theater within your own mind. You're creating your own unique movie, different from anybody else. And why that's so special is because a lot of people also talk about like why they feel such a strong connection to the RJs that they used to listen to when they were growing up. I think they feel this because they almost feel like they created art together with them. And
Mhm.
similar story with podcasters, similar story with my favorite podcast, which is that when they speak, I imagine. And in that, we both are co-creating, which is why I generally feel a much stronger association with them. So generally, I trust them a lot more. And this has strong implications also from um, recall perspective. Memory encoding with podcasting is much higher. Recall is much higher. Affinity is much higher. So even for brands that are looking to build things like affinity, looking to build things like resonance, recall, looking to rebrand themselves in a particular light, the audio medium is wonderful because automatically ad blindness is a lot lower, people's guards are a lot lower, and you have the ability to co-create with people as opposed to something visual, which is beautiful in its own right, but with something visual, you're looking at a masterpiece where somebody has created a painting and you're just admiring. Here, somebody given you a brush, and they have a brush themselves and they're painting and you're painting alongside with them. So you may admire one type of painting in one way, and you may feel emotionally connected to another type of painting in another way. And I think that's the beauty of audio, and that's the beauty of podcast, and that's the beauty of radio in itself also. Now to your second question, which is a very interesting question, is who are the podcast listeners? I think the broad answer to this, which is why you're seeing the market grow at the rate that it's growing, is it's like asking who are the TV watchers, or it's like asking who are the phone users. Everybody is a podcast listener. Everybody can be a podcast listener, and generally, it's a interesting medium because regardless of what you try, and this is why I also like the audio side of podcasts in some ways a lot, because think about the applications you have on your phone now. 99% of those applications are all trying to fight for the same 4 to 5 hour window of your day. So
Yeah.
you may be a direct competitor, or an indirect competitor, but it doesn't matter. But because you are competing against the same 4 to 5 hours. So Instagram, ironically enough, is also competing against Temple Run. And Temple Run is also competing against, Call of Duty.
That's a fresh
And Call of
perspective.
Duty is also competing
Mhm.
against Zomato because it's the same 5 hours. So I'm not a direct competitor, but I'm definitely an indirect competitor because it's just those 5 hours that everybody's competing for. But now the real question is, how long do I have my device with me? And where I could have consumed stuff, but I don't have the ability to look at my device and consume stuff. So data suggests you have your phone for at least 9 more hours than that. So you have your phone with you for about 15 hours a day. So in those 9 hours, your barrier of entry for your competition is a lot harder. Whatever Temple Run does, how much ever it tries to throw money at this problem, it is going to have a very hard time competing for those 9 hours. Similar story with, any platform that you're looking at that falls into the 5 hour game is going to have a very hard time. Whatever it does, it's going to have a very hard time. Audio is interesting in this because audio competes against music. Audio competes against a couple of other things, but definitely not nearly the same amount. So I think anytime somebody is multitasking and they need to do something, but they can't look at their phone, those are potential podcast listeners. Anytime somebody is trying to upskill themselves but is lazy or is unable to look at their device, those are podcast listeners. Anytime somebody is trying to take an old behavior pattern of theirs and replace that old behavior pattern of theirs with a more accessible behavior pattern. I'm talking about people that used to listen to the Guru Granth Sahib, for example, in their homes on cassettes, and now want to take the Guru Granth Sahib with them on their devices, but don't want to, eat up into their local storage. They're podcast listeners. So everybody is a podcast listener, but then you got your, I would say, like your most ardent podcast listeners are generally folks that are, and data will show this, are falling into the devotion category. Are people that consume a lot of devotion oriented content, people that like to consume true crime. And why people who like to consume true crime is because generally, even if you make somebody watch something that's horror oriented, or make somebody listen to something that's horror oriented, they will feel a lot more fear, and they will feel a lot more adrenaline if they listen to something horror oriented. So generally a lot of people skew towards this because it gives them that kick a little higher. It's like getting a larger and better quality of that same drug that they seek when they watch a horror movie. That's why true crime is such a big category. And then finally, anybody that's trying to learn and upskill themselves in a quick and efficient fashion will normally turn to podcasts. So these three are the, I would say, the like these three are Goldilocks zone of people that tend to want to listen to podcasts. Normally, people who listen to podcasts are also slightly higher educated. They are have slightly higher income brackets or more disposable income. They are normally between the ages of 22 to 40. And That's why brands tend to like them, because if they enter their subconscious, uh, these people do have purchasing power capability. So those are also certain demographic markers of people that do listen to podcasts. Women listen to podcasts a lot. So if you want to hit the women market, podcasts are a great market. So it's the only media format, if I'm not mistaken. I think there was a Nielsen report that said it outstrips men. 51% women listen, 49% men listen.
And I think to some extent, I've seen that in my statistics also when it comes to analytics. All right.
Mm.
So, I think after listener, the next question is, of course, going towards category. But I want to first tell you a bit of a small story that happened in my life. So there's this friend of mine. So whenever I launched a podcast and I would like put up the YouTube links and this and that and everything, and she would always come back saying, "Ki yaar, 1 hour, 40 minutes, 45 minutes. I would rather consume short form content." So then one day she called me and she said, "Bharat, you know what? Today I listened to your whole podcast." So I said, "Why?" So here's something. So here's a hack she found, which is this is how I decoded it, but this is not what she said. But association creates affinity. So when you associate something, a thought, you entertain a thought in your mind for long enough, you start having affinity towards that thought. So what she did is every time she would come back from work, every day she would come back from work and she would not feel like hitting the gym. What she started doing is every day after coming back from work, she would start listening to a fitness oriented podcast. And she would just
Mm.
keep that playing in the loop. So she comes back home, and then for the next 1 hour, it's about fitness and this and muscle groups and activity, blah, blah. 7 o'clock, she's in the gym, right?
Nice.
Because it's passively there in the background. So your mind is going fitness, fitness, fitness. Now, seven
Yeah.
o'clock, you have to go to the gym. So this is one category I found. So fitness oriented podcasts, which are successful, or I mean, at least in my experience, I came across a couple of these, as you said, crime or storytelling formats. So according to your data that you came across, what is topping the market? What is just making it?
Yeah. Well, your friend is very smart, and she's using the Pavlov dog experiment, Pavlov's dog.
Oh,
Uh,
what is that?
to
Okay.
Pavlov's dog was basically trying to see whether you can create associations in animals and seeing how cognitively aware they were. So, uh, what this person would, you've heard this experiment 100%. Somebody would ring a bell and then give a dog food. I think the
Ah,
scientist name was
yes. Right.
doing this. Ring the bell, give the dog food. Ring the bell, give the dog food. And then over time, basically started to see whether an association synaptically had been created in the dog's mind. So whenever the bell would be rung, this dog would start to salivate. And that was a very major moment in sort of the study of how, not just, animal minds, but minds in general work. And that's exactly what she's doing, where she's basically playing something that's creating triggers that's automatically leading to some sort of behavior pattern. A lot of psychology and like CBT principles also work on the same format, some regard. But yeah, so sorry, I digress. You were mentioning something with regards to what categories
Yeah.
do
What
well.
categories are making the rounds?
The categories of consumption are a little different than the categories of creation.
Yeah.
Categories of consumption are categories like, for example, um, like I said, categories of consumption, devotion, there is no competition. It's
Hmm.
not humanly possible to compete with devotion as a category.
Okay.
Um, it's so far ahead that it's beyond belief. Post that point, so our data does sort of back this up as well. Like we sort of have had also the Sadhguru podcast hosted with us and the Sri Sri Ravi Shankar podcast hosted with us,
Oh, how
and
did
we've
that
had
do? Okay.
oh, and how did that do is it's unbelievable. It charted not just in India, every single country. It was the uh, top one or two podcasts in the spirituality category across the world.
Oh,
Um, then the Bhagavad Gita podcast, Stories of Mahabharat podcast. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Mythology, spirituality, devotion. It's just not normal. Post that point, you see true crime, and then you do see true crime having a major spike during the later hours of the day. And generally, people may consume that for a little bit longer. Then self-development, self-growth, both occupationally, academically, and otherwise as well. Also, which is life skills, does very well.
hmm.
So, a podcast, for example, falls into that category. Of people hearing perspectives of different individuals, learning anecdotally through their stories from their experiences, etc., etc. This falls into that category. And then the last one is light eroticism. So you will see like romantic storytelling with like Mills and Boone kind of
Oh,
romantic story that does very well in podcasts. Again, theater of the mind, that I'm sure prevails and does very well.
so storytelling is basically a very good format for podcasting.
Very, very much so. Very much so. I mean, if I am to also look at my own consumption pattern, I consume like far too much content for my own good, but uh, it's primarily storytelling based content. Like I started by listening to a lot of like interview based content, but now I just predominantly listen to monologue based podcasts that are storytelling oriented.
Because from a, I mean, podcast, I mean, what I get to hear a lot is that interviews are, uh, you know, for example, I actually had this in the list of questions that I wanted to ask you is a case study point of view was that TRS is such a huge hit in India, right? The Ranveer show. Or when we talk about Joe Rogan as a good example. I mean, these are two that I follow the most. That's why I asked you. And they're also very successful. So they are interview format podcasts. Storytelling podcast, I've seen less of charting in India. So yeah, from a case study point of view also, why do you think TRS is such a big success in India?
So, first off, I would actually like the Joe Rogan podcast is an interesting example because a lot of people also ask the question like Joe Rogan's podcasts are three hours long. So why is everybody advocating for shorter podcasts? Like why does our data tell us that 20-minute, 25-minute long podcasts do better than 3 hour long podcasts? It's also because if you even look at Joe Rogan's podcast, the genius in their marketing was that they've got there are two channels on YouTube. There's the Joe Rogan Show, and then there's GRE Clips. GRE Clips outstrips the Joe Rogan Show in terms of views and consumption by I think a matter of tenfold. So their own show beats their own show in terms of shorter content,
Yeah.
which is an interesting to note. I would state that um, first off, why do these shows do well? I think first off, they follow that urge inside us to consume talk shows that are less structured, so like it's like having a much more candid coffee with Karan. Not that coffee with Karan was not a candid conversation, but it's like it's it's relatable also because they feel like mortals that are talking to maybe uh maybe people that feel like demigods, but they're talking to them in a frame. I'm specifically speaking about the Joe Rogan show because I've consumed that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Me too.
uh,
Yeah.
they're speaking to these like demigod like individuals, but they're speaking to them as though they are very relatable humans, and they're speaking to them about everything under the sun. And so you get to understand those people and how they take from a very holistic lens. It's also great to see how they folks like Joe Rogan himself. Um, I know that there's a lot of controversy around that his podcast, but I don't believe anybody could contest that he's a very good host. Like he knows how to weave in with conversations, get information out of people. He knows how to make the guests feel very comfortable. He has tidbits of information that he adds along the way that are very valuable. He knows when to let the speaker shine and when not to interrupt too much, and then he knows when to do the opposite as well. So I'm fairly certain if somebody who's a talk show host was looking at him, they'd look at him in the mastery of what he's learned. And I'm sure Ranveer does the same. So I think it gives us the opportunity to feel like it's the closest that a lot of people can feel like they're being able to have a very candid conversation with people that they admire.
Hmm.
Because they can see themselves in Joe Rogan. So that's why I think these types of shows do very well. But there's a flip side, which is a negative side to this, which is that it also is very difficult for there to be too many of these, and too many of these that are very successful, right? Like, why do we like Jimmy Fallon? Why do we like Trevor Noah? Why do we like James Corden? We like these people also because of their like sheer like relatability. Like they are so human and they are so approachable and they're so funny. you know they've got all of those attributes that we see in maybe ourselves and maybe in our friend. So which is why when they're speaking to a Nicole Kidman, or when they're speaking to somebody like a Ben Affleck or anybody, you feel as though that's the closest you have to a candid conversation like that with that same individual. So um I don't know whether I am making sense, but I'm telling you anecdotally that I just think that you feel like you can vicariously live through a Joe Rogan, or you can vicariously live through a Jimmy Fallon or a James Corden. James Corden is not trying to be perfect, and I think in his imperfection lies him being a perfect host. And that's where I think a lot of podcast hosts can derive stuff from, in their imperfections.
Um, so to be honest, I want to start on, uh, you know, I want to continue on an honest note. What is your advice for the podcaster who's trying to make it today? And I'll first start with my story. I was an RJ with Radio Machi, and I come from a radio background where I learned voice very well, voiceovers, and how to use your voice in your advantage. And I've done a lot of uh, ads and a lot of voiceover for different projects. I thought it's a very beautiful opportunity to take up podcasting, with podcasts growing in India. And I've been doing storytelling in Bangalore and open mics for a very long time. And I thought it'd be amazing to take it up. But the challenges that this medium and this particular format of content comes with, a content format comes with, is huge. Because the kind of challenges that you face is, as a podcaster who's growing out without an organizational setup, you need to learn everything from scratch. You need to understand how audio hardware works, softwares work, everything. And there's so much. If you're somebody who's well funded, and if you're somebody who's loaded and you can easily hire 10 different guys to do 10 jobs, but as an average podcaster, as somebody who's listening to this right now, I think he can connect to my story. Is you need to do a lot of it on your own, and there's so many things going wrong that you can't even, you every day there's a learning, every day there's something going wrong. So, what is your advice to the podcaster in 2024? What what is the general roadmap on what we can do?
It's a really good question. So I would actually firstly strip down your statement, and when you said the podcaster that wants to make it, right? Now, if you can flesh out that statement a little bit more and define for yourself what make it means, that's a really good starting point. What is make it? Is make it like having a ton of downloads, like streams? Is make it build a personal brand? Is make it like make this into a monetizable entity? Um, is, uh, make it be able to speak freely about something that I have a passion for and develop a community around it? It's unfortunately a question that a lot of people, when it comes to podcasts, they don't spend time initially when they think about that question itself. The hardware and software is really hard, but at least that's an easier question that you don't need to look inward and ask yourself the answer for, because it is a long journey, and it's a difficult one. But if you know what you're trying to make it towards, it helps. Number one. Number two is, uh, I would actually really try and understand the transaction. So what that basically means, and again, this is something that such few podcasters do, that I wish I could, uh, sort of speak to folks before they start. What is the transaction is basically that the listener, or the person you're hoping is going to listen, is giving you something much more valuable than money. They're giving you their time, which is it's a resource that they're not going to get back. So what are you giving them back in that same 20-minute period that's worth that 20 minutes of their time? So the transaction needs to be very easily laid out. I give you 20 minutes, you give me what? Or vice versa, you give me 20 minutes and I will give you this. Very few podcasters, in my opinion, answer this question. And even if that answer is something which, like, for example, is very small, you'll at least find your tribe in that. You'll find the people that care about that transaction, and it'll give you a really good guiding light for your podcast. It'll also make brands really understand what the hell this is all about, right? Like, so I, I'll try and give you an example. Let's say I was starting a nutrition based podcast, right? I would make the transaction be, give me 20 minutes of your week and I will give you back 2 years of your life, right? Something hard hitting and strong enough that it makes people sit back in their chair. Give me 20 minutes of your week and I will give you 2 lakhs more in your bank account. Even if you don't need to state it overtly. If I'm a financial advisor and I was creating a podcast around being more financially literate, right? And it doesn't even need to be something that's numeric. Give me 20 minutes of your week and I'll make you the most interesting person on the dining table. But then I know this is my deal, right? So then I know what I'm going to do and what my commitment is. And that is also going to then take from the first point. And the first point will also dictate what people, what my call to actions are going to be. A lot of people, when they create a podcast, they're rudderless because they don't really know what they're trying to do here. So if I was creating like if I was creating a podcast from a community oriented perspective, a lot of people don't look at that podcast in terms of, okay, if I'm going to create a community, then they never figure out that their call to action needs to be, how do I push people into a catchment? Like, how do I tell people, if you enjoyed this episode, we'd love to catch you on our Reddit thread, where you can tell us about what you want the next episodes to be about, XYZ, blah 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 blah. And let's say I'm trying to create a community around pregnant moms, right? Now, that's a very strong community. It's something that a brand would really, really like pay money for as well if I'm trying to monetize this community. Or I just want to create a nice like self-help group around, women going through pregnancy, right? what I would basically state is that if you found this podcast valuable, join us on this Reddit thread where we all communicate about, our woes and our, joys and blah 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 blah. And hopefully that community can become a place where, people are sending pictures of their babies for the first time, and people are asking questions of, should I be having formula, or should I be like using this kind of oil, or should I not, or blah blah blah. And then eventually I'll take that community and that podcast to Mama Earth, and I'll be like, listen, I may not have 10,000 like downloads for each episode. I have 1,000, but I have 1,000 pregnant women that are listening in and that I have a very strong association with, right? So a lot of people get people to listen to their podcast, but don't tell them where to go. So a lot of the biggest problem is everybody's focusing on the top of their funnel. So they keep trying to pour more water onto the top of their podcast, but they haven't thought about the fact that their bucket itself is leaking from the bottom, and they're never getting those listeners back. So every next episode, what happens is they try to pour more water on top, which is very difficult. But not never thinking about, oh, what about the water at the bottom? Is that still staying? So that's something that these are like very fundamental questions that one needs to think about. Because of podcasting being such an emotional medium where the relationship is so strong, the person also puts their trust in you. So if they're putting their trust in you, then you have to make sure to be authentic. You have to make sure to get that episode out at the same time every week. You need to make sure that the segments are also very clear cut. The last thing a podcast listener wants is unpredictability. An episode launching on Sunday when it was supposed to launch on Wednesday. I know this sounds like such a small thing, but it's such a big thing because it's like you said, a podcast is often used as association. Now, I used a podcast to go to the gym, let's say. A new episode didn't come out. Suddenly, I'm screwed, right? Because now either one or two things happen. I listen to a previous episode, or I break my relationship with this person. Or let's say that the podcast structure completely changes. I banked on this structure because I was supposed to listen in for 40 minutes because that's how long my gym time was, right? And it was going to flow in this format because that's what people are using podcasts for. I'm washing my clothes. This is when I do this. This is when I do this. This is when I do this. Okay, in segment three, subconsciously, I've thought that segment three is a little lighter. I can do this with it. If I'm continuously moving things around and I'm changing the relationship and I'm not being authentic, I'm screwing up this relationship over and over again. And all I'm basically doing is taking a pin, or rather a knife, and stabbing the bottom of this bucket and creating more holes so more water can pour out. I know I'm providing a lot of analogies and metaphors and stuff, but these are the important things about a podcast more than anything else in my book.
Oh my god. Gautam, can I just do this? My god, Gurudev.
No, you're a very,
Oh,
very
that
kind.
is brilliant. That is what it is, actually. Yeah,
That is so true.
that is so true. That is so the heart of what a podcast is, right? It's a friendship. It's a friendship. It's a friendship. And that is so beautiful what you said. That it is a, you have to be very clear on the transaction because there's time, and man, that's wow. I'm serious. That's the most eye-opening thing I've heard about podcast ever. That's I have been learning a lot. So
You. That means the world to me, man. That means the world. You mentioned we kind of go back to Joe Rogan. I really don't think that he actually cared in the beginning for his podcast to be what it's become.
mm,
I honestly think that that guy wanted to learn in each episode. And in his learning, he was vicariously being the audience member. I really think, I may be wrong, but I really think he's fooled me. But every time he's having a conversation, it's just what am I going to learn from Brian Cox about astrophysics? And like in that created beauty, I think.
So the thing is that I am somewhere along the same lines because I think, and so is TRS, because I'm a very curious person by nature. Anybody who knows me knows that I must have called them an average person in my life. I must have asked them 5,000 questions by now. So I ask a lot of questions and I'm very curious and I love to learn. That's just my basic nature. So the idea behind me starting a podcast was to yeah, to be very clear, to be honest about it, to create a content format around it, and probably also look at a monetary function that it can provide to me as a career. So the idea was to meet people who provide depth to life, who provide a certain amount of depth into subjects, into common subjects like podcasting, or maybe it goes into brain chemistry or neurology, or it goes into computers. It's this depth. So my audience, I think, and the question that you asked, why it's called Antaraag, is because it takes you inward. The idea is there, the concept is there, and my audience, I think, the people who see value in going deeper into intellectually titillating conversations, into really having that 20 minutes every day where they feel like they had a little more depth inside themselves, where they went deeper into a subject, you know. So, but this was and I've been learning along those lines on how you can create an interview format and how to, the audio hardware and the softwares and what you can use and set up. But what you said is precisely actually what a podcast is. It is a relationship, it is a friendship. Yeah, it's a friendship.
I'll give you a really interesting example. I used to hear a podcaster is like I consider him a friend. I listen to his podcast so much. It was a podcast called Lore. It's one of the most successful podcasts ever. Like, um, I was recently at a conference, and the funny thing about like the most successful podcasts ever is that you still don't know what the bloody person looks like. So I was at this conference, and I was fortunate enough to be speaking at this conference, and I was walking. And when I was walking, I walked past a voice that was really familiar to me. And I turned and I didn't know who the hell I'm looking at, but this voice was the most familiar voice I've ever heard. And I was like, it can't be. There's no way. There's no way it can be. And I mean, it's crazy, but it turned out to be the host of Floor. And he had 100 million downloads. He's created a TV show out of the podcast. There's books out of the podcast, blah, 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 blah. Um, I mean, it was one of the weird, like, surreal moments for me because I I don't I don't get starstruck ever, and but in I think this was the closest I've ever been to being starstruck because this was somebody who I literally felt as though I felt as though we had like an equation, like we had a relationship, even though we never met. And it was funny because we ended up like on a table drinking together. He was being honored and being inducted into like he was being given an award and whatnot. And there was a conversation happening on that table with only eminent podcasters, like the podcasters that everybody quotes during conversation. They're like, I want to be like this guy, I want to be like Guy Raz, I want to be like whatever. They were on that table, and I was like that like idiot in the corner sitting in that table as well for some inexplicable reason. But I was very lucky to be there. There was another podcaster just as big. I'm not going to give away the name because the interesting thing is that I want the audience to keep guessing. So this podcaster has been creating a podcast for the last 10 years, has has around the same number of downloads, 100 million downloads. Do you know what equipment he uses to record his podcast?
What?
His phone. It. That's it. That's it. And one of the most successful, profitable podcasts that exists. He said sometimes I connect he connects his old school like wired uh, Apple AirPod into his phone and then records like that if his kids are being loud. And his main point was that I'm not going to like hide behind good equipment as a podcaster. My ability is my storytelling. I don't need a mic. I don't need the camera. I don't need this. I don't need that. And it's his standing and basically saying that I will be the most successful podcaster. And he wasn't saying it with ego or hubris. He said my podcast became good and people liked it when I was making it on a phone 5 years ago. Why on earth would I change that now? He said that's just a distraction. And a lot of people like will get all of these different things and then try to get a MIDI player and then try to get four different mics and this crazy setup because they want that Instagram vibe and they want their you know Rode mic or Shure mics, and both of us as well have our mics in front of us. But I was taken aback by this because this person's a giant among podcasters, like a giant in the way that if I've said Aaron's name, you may not know him, but this name you know, and he records on his phone. So your equipment doesn't matter for shit, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think I get it.
I mean, for me also, it's a big learning exercise, right? It's like it's not about me having this mic in front of me. It's about what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah. I think I was just lost along the way, to be honest. I have no shame accepting it. The thing is that okay, so I would love to share a story. So the thing is that I was only 22 when 21. I was only 21 when I got picked up as an RJ, and once I went on air, my competition was the other 10 years into RJing, 12 years into RJing, 13 years into RJing. And they were all these big night shows, and they were all like, oh no, you can't beat this person's too good. So, but what I did is, I would not take my bike. I would go to office, and then I would. This is something that I'm saying on a shit. I mean, on a podcast for the first time, and I would come back in a cab with a recorded show, and I would change my name in the cab, and I would listen to my own show as a different person in the cab, and I would note the reactions that people in the cab were giving when my show was playing, and when it was switched off and when it was switched on. I did this for 3 to 4 months straight, and I picked up one thing very quick, that comedy was the way to go now when it comes to night shows, and everybody else was not into comedy at that point of time. So I started doing open mics. I started going into open mic circles in Bangalore, and started doing a lot of gigs. And I was not great. I was very bad, but I became better as I went at it. I put a lot of hard work into learning storytelling techniques and voice modulation. And finally, when I would go on air and say, "I am Batman." It's just things just worked. So I see where you're coming from. It's just that since I switched from there, my point of view changed because when you look at the competition in India, it looks very too intimidating in terms of the setup. It looks too intimidating. So the obvious thought was, okay, I need to upgrade and upgrade and upgrade. And where does it stop? It's the first mic. Okay, let's get 3 more mics. Okay, let's get funding. Okay, let's do this. Let's get more cameras. Let's do this and this and this and this and this. But somewhere along the way, the central thread, which I think is common between radio and when it comes to podcasting, is the relationship and the storytelling. Cultivating that friendship with your listener.
Yeah, just make sure that you're in as many platforms as possible. Make sure that you're looking at your data because it's the best way that you're actually hearing your listeners talk back to you. Unless you can create a qualitative feedback loop, which is even nicer, like ask them to write into you. You know, I I I think I hope to a little bit of a degree that this reelification, Instagramification of podcasts, you know, is a bit of a phase. I get it. I get it. I get that it needs to happen. And I get that like everybody wants to go to like a fancy studio. I don't even mind that. I would rather I'm okay with that. I think that that's phenomenal as long as they also focus, and that will happen because listeners are unforgiving in the way that listeners and viewers, after that initial spike, like this is what happened with like Clubhouse, right? For example, people want quality at the end of the day, right? You can put as much bedazzle and you can put as many like as much jewelry on something, but at the end of the day, people want quality that comes out. So if the audience will demand that, and I think that will force people to start creating content that's deserving or worthy of that audience. And in that, you'll see a better breed of shows that's coming out. Not better breed of mics, better breed of shows.
But what happened to Clubhouse? This is a very controversial yet much talked about, at one point, much talked about question is what happened to Clubhouse? Just what happened to Clubhouse? And what do you think?
I think that it was like nobody wants to listen to random unstructured conversation. In the beginning, it was interesting because in this room, Jeff Bezos came. In this room, this person came. In this room, that person came, and everybody was stuck in their houses. So you know, it was it felt like the ultimate democratization of conversations, and that anybody could have conversations with anybody. There's a really interesting story. The founders of Clubhouse didn't want Clubhouse to grow the way that it did. They had no interest. In fact, they had a major problem with it because I don't think they believed it was ready. I think that they feel that it was almost like a disservice that happened to their company because they were onto something interesting. But the problem was that, like, after a little while it just started to become like four people that came and started having a conversation without structure or thought about what that conversation is going to be or why should somebody pay attention to it. Then that created a vicious cycle because uh, people didn't come and join those rooms. Because people didn't join those rooms, the people that were hosting those conversations didn't feel like having those conversations anymore, and it just went lower and lower and lower down that same thread and went into nothingness. I think that's kind of what happened.
When it comes to that, I sort of also wanted to ask you when I was going through, when I was doing my research on how this started and what inspired you, and there was a lot of material I could find on how you started the company and what was the inspiration behind it. I also came across this particular piece where you had faced a toxic work culture in the past, and that inspired you to, I don't know if this is correct because I found this on the internet, uh, and that inspired you to bring a new approach in your company that would change things. Is that true? And do you want to talk about it?
And I'm so I wouldn't say it was a toxic work culture. It was definitely incongruent to me. It
Hmm.
was very rigid as a work culture. It was very stifling as a work culture, and it was very hierarchical as a work culture. But for some people that may resonate very well, and people like like very you know tight lines, and they like structure, and they like I didn't resonate with it personally. And I know people that have enjoyed working at banks and stuff, but I I felt as though it was a I the I just didn't feel as though like my contributions had any impact outside of, nothing truly. And I couldn't stomach that thought. And I couldn't stomach the thought of whenever I tried to do anything outside of my very specific job role, that I would be mildly reprimanded, if not reprimanded, told don't. I didn't, I mean, you can't take a 21-year-old and tell a 21-year-old to live in such a box. Like that's too small of a box to take somebody so young in their life and confine them in. In my opinion, this is my opinion. I may be fully wrong. Uh, I with Hubhopper, it's really fun and beautiful because I saw that, so I tried to take. Now here's the funny part, right? Like, what do you value? Like, will Hubhopper be as big as Barclays ever? No, of course not, because you got a bank on one side, you got a podcast company on the other side. So you got to be realistic in terms of that. But then what do you value, right? Like for me, there's no hierarchy in Hubhopper. It's zilch. It's just flat. And even when it comes to job roles, um, you have the ability to move from department A to department B. There's a lot of, cross-functional work that takes place, which is a lot of fun. Um, there's a ruling almost within Hubhopper that whenever you're working on what you're working on, you should work on, like in a very small capacity, work with somebody else who's in another team that's diametrically opposite to what you do, because it will allow you to both learn a new skill and also allow you to be empathetic towards the work that your fellow colleague is doing. Because a lot of people are like, we are doing very hard work, they're doing nonsense. That's just how people generally operate. This creates a very empathetic outlook, and it teaches people along the way, and it's great fun. And try as much as we can. I don't know whether we do it all the time, but try as much as we can to make people believe, know, and be aware of the fact that everything that each person does in the organization, because it's like what's a mid-sized company, right? So it has a significant impact on the company. So like their contributions actually truly matter. Like if they stopped working or if they stopped being, there would be a negative impact on the organization. So uh, I think people need that when they're working. At least I needed that. I needed to know that what I was doing had some part to play in the larger whole. Because if not, then I wasn't self-contented by taking a check home. Um, to what end? So of course there will be a lot of opposing views to these sorts of things and whatever. I get it, but this is just my thought process.
What drives you? Is it social impact? Is it impact that drives you?
Yeah, impact to a very large degree. Impact to a very large degree does drive me, definitely. Um, I think that's why we chose like podcasting also. Like who on earth, like 20, it's by luck that podcasting has become as big as it has.
Really?
We saw a lot of opportunity that could have been really big, but who knew whether it would explode in the next 4 or 5 years of us being in this space. That's also a big part of, like, we did see a space that needed needed somebody to dedicatedly work towards it, like a full company, and needed to, in some partial ways, spear, like torch bear it, and fight for it and advocate for it. And you know in that there was purpose and a community that needed to be banded together. Like, I again, like I said, depends on what your motivations are, right? Like, um I remember when we were just starting Hubhopper, fintech was like just at the advent of booming. And the logical move would have been to go into fintech, especially from my background, right? Like I'd just come out of a bank, I was an econ major, blah 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 blah, go into fintech. But I didn't care to do that because I remember it was even brought up with me. So why don't fintech's exploding? Why don't you do something in fintech? But my literal thought in my head was enough people are fighting for it. Enough people are trying. Enough people are trying to push fintech forward and make it work. This space doesn't have anybody. It needs somebody. So like I'd rather do this than do that.
I think the reason I asked you that question is because I faced something very similar in one of the companies that I worked in. Very rigid structure. And I think office politics also. Does that also. Is there any way to fight office politics? Is it ever possible to ever make office politics go away, or is that just a part of who we are?
I didn't have office politics when I was in the bank because everybody was way older than me. Like
Okay.
so much older. It was ridiculous. I didn't have any office politics. I was just uh, so I don't have very good, like, a retort. I don't have a very good retort on that, to be honest.
Because in my case, the reason I asked you that question was because in my case, that is what I face the most. There's a fun story also around there because I had created a structure where I thought I would successfully demolish office politics. But then a digital marketing company that I was running initially, it eventually winded up because of office politics, which I started to fight and to not make it work. So that is why I asked you if there is any, if because a lot of entrepreneurs also come on the show. So the question always comes that, how can we make a managerial structure better? Is there any approach that we can take to fight office politics or to make it more free? Like all the points that you listed out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe those subconsciously building an empathy into the organization, creating less hierarchy in the organization. That whole concept of a rotten egg, like any time that or sorry, a rotten apple spoils the bushel. We've, I think, I think hire for culture, like hire. I think people like I don't think most roles, especially roles that I'm not talking about like surgeons or pilots, for example, not like
Mm.
stuff like that. But like a lot of roles that a lot of us do are learnable roles. And so if you hire somebody with the aptitude and you hire somebody with the culture that you have, it's 10x in my opinion better in the long run than hiring a specialist in that space and in that capability, but who doesn't align with your thought process. Like the more people we've let go of, mm, much more people in the organization because of culture mismatch than anything else.
Mm.
So they've actually been like really good for the company and really been doing like they've been hitting their targets and doing what they've been doing. But we've still let them go because of culture mismatches. And yeah,
So when you say culture mismatch, the what was so because I also know that a lot of companies actually have interviews where they have cultural round nowadays, where they understand if the culture of the company matches, the person who's coming on board. So, I mean, I don't know anybody who's listening to this right now. What would that be like?
I'm the culture round. I don't even do specialist rounds anymore at all. I hardly ask questions what to do with the job. I have nothing. I just ask them about what I by the time the by the time the round happens with me in the organization, which is like what four interviews. I'm the fourth interview. There are three interviews prior to me. In the three interviews prior to me, the specialists have already spoken and asked questions that are they're much more capable at asking those questions that are very specific to job role. What at least I believe I'm more capable of doing than a lot of people would be like, okay, does this piece of the puzzle fit this puzzle? Like, will it work? Will this relationship work with the entire group altogether? So I don't ask occupation related questions. I'm asking questions about their hobbies. I ask questions about what they like to do for fun. I ask them questions about I probe deeper into what led to them wanting to leave their previous organization, where they see their life going, um, you know, things like of that nature. I hardly ask any of those questions.
I see. Because this has become a very it's become a thing that most of the companies also always look for people who they resonate with, so that becomes a group that can thrive and grow together.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, for sure.
I have learned so much from you that I've not learned in like a year from most of the content that I see online in terms of podcasts. And I'm sure that this content would be really, really beneficial to any podcaster who's out there who's trying, when I say trying to make it, trying to grow and trying to put out their content and form a relationship with the listeners. And I think this is going to be gold. Thank you so much. Thank you. And with all the mistakes that we made and everything that happened, you're so kind. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No, man, no mistakes. Just appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Gautam. Thank you. Thank you for being on the show. I'm honored. Thank you.